About 6 months ago, I got this microphone, and for those of you watching on YouTube, I got the web camera at about the same time, probably the same order. And for the past 6+ months, I've been telling myself, I'm going to start a podcast. And, I've had time enough to think about what I was going to do with this podcast that I've been planning on and off for so long now. And originally, what I was going to do was I was going to have the YouTube videos be just video versions of the top 10 things we can learn. Originally, that series on Instagram was sort of the 10 things leaders should know or leaders can learn. I was fiddling with it for a little while there. And so I wanted to do a video version of that. And that's essentially what I'm doing now that I finally started that project. And that goes through each book that I read, 10 things that we can learn from that book. It gives you a little visual representation of it, a few sentences for each. But what I was going to do for the podcast was I was going to, in this more extended format, get more time. And I wanted to cover the whole book, not necessarily a review, not a summary. That's not what I do. I'm more interested in the usable information for people who are trying to improve themselves and the world around them. That's what I'm all about. So I was going to go through all the notes, all the bookmarks I took for each book. But that sounds really dry, doesn't it? I would have made it work, made it a little more interesting than just sort of reading through one after another. But at the same time, I think we can do better. So now that I've had all this time to, not that I was planning all 6 months, but had a little more time to sort of iron out how I want to do this. I've landed on using the book. So, if each podcast is a different book, and there will be podcasts that aren't about books, but that's the general premise. So if each one is one book, we'll use the book as sort of a jumping off place, and we'll take the book, not really go through individual notes, but instead have it be more thematic. So what comes to me theme-wise based on what the author is covering in the book. So, funny thing about starting a podcast, and I'm sure this has crossed a few of your minds, is that, we're let's say 15 years into the podcast thing. And of course I just started with radio programs, taking their recordings and making them downloadable. And of course that was, those were the first podcasts that I listened to. They were probably the first podcasts that you listened to. But now that we're 15 years in, my mom, and I'm sure she's not the only one, she has a bunch of cutouts from the newspaper on the fridge. And she's got an interesting sense of humor. It's a little dry, but when she's being humorous. And one of the things she has on the fridge is a headline from, I would assume, the New York Times that says, "Can you hear the podcast fatigue?" Which, as someone who for a while now has been planning on starting a podcast in some version or another, it is a little intimidating because it's absolutely right. There's just oversaturation. There's, it's too many. But when you've got stuff to say, you've got stuff to say. And I just hope that I can provide value for those of you who are going to be listening to it. And of course, I did some searching as far as titles, and first few things that popped into my head related to what I do, things like common ground. So common ground is of course taken because common ground. I mean, somebody was going to take that. It's not a popular podcast, and I don't even know if they're still active, but that's fine. Thought about Rise Together. I think that was what I looked up. So Rise Together is taken by Rachel Hollis's husband, of all people. So Rachel Hollis, she's got a bunch of best-selling books, and apparently her husband has a podcast. I tried We're in This Together. We're in This Together Now, the song by 9 Inch Nails. That's always one of my favorites, and it's sort of it's a good thematic title related to what I do. But while those particular words weren't taken, I mean, there's one that's We're All in This Together. That one's taken. There's an In This Together podcast. So anyway, I think the working title that I've come up with is Individuals United or Unified Individuals. I haven't decided which order I'm going to go with, but that's my working title for now. We'll see what happens. I'm not married to any of these ideas. But the book we're covering today, now that you guys have put up with 7 minutes of introduction, the book we're covering is Bill O'Reilly. Yes, that Bill O'Reilly. He has a new book called The United States of Trump, How the President Really Sees America. And it came out on September 24th, so that's a little more than a week ago now. And I listened to the book. If for you guys who know me, and in these initial podcasts, that's going to be pretty much everyone listening or watching. For you guys who know me, I listen to books rather than read them. I can listen about 3 to 4 times faster than I can actually read, as far as comprehension goes. And so that on top of being able to do it while I'm walking the dogs or cooking or various other activities, gym, whatever, makes it a lot better for me time-wise. So listen to the book, I think Saturday, Sunday, so something like that, and did a little bit of processing, put out 10 Things We Can Learn, put out a video yesterday, and then it's going to be the first podcast as well. Now, Bill O'Reilly obviously has his own bias worked in, and this was the first book of his that I actually read. He's written a whole bunch of books. They're very popular. I assume when you have a very highly rated TV show, you've sort of got a built-in audience for your book, and I assume that his audience is generally on the conservative side. But his books are, I don't think they're quite as partisan, or at least this one. Again, this is the first one that I read. So it doesn't seem as partisan as the clips of the TV show, his O'Reilly Factor TV show that's now off the air, but was on the air for a good long time. So he really gets into the journalism aspect of what he does, which I assume is what he was doing before the O'Reilly Factor, and he probably incorporated it a little bit. And so he takes it rather seriously. Now, he tries to sort of present himself in the material as being unbiased, but we all have our own implicit bias. I mean, even when I try to present the material, the notes that I take out of each book, just deciding what I select, and then how I word it, there's a bias that I have. So all we have to do is just recognize that, accept it, and get what we can out of the material. So when I say bias, and I cover this a little bit in my review, I review all the books that I read up on Goodreads, if you want to find the reviews. And I cover this a little bit in the review, but his bias is more for omission than it is for how he says what he says within the book. And what I mean by that is he doesn't cover certain things, or he really skirts around certain issues that could be potentially problematic regarding Trump. Now, in these podcasts, I don't want to necessarily deal with day-to-day topics. This isn't a current events podcast. This is about broad concepts, what we can learn from the books or other materials that I cover. And as far as bias goes, that bias of omission is something to keep an eye open for. You want to know if, and Howard Zinn comes to mind with this. Now, Howard Zinn, of course, did exactly what he sort of professed. Well, let's get right into it. He said that by telling the truth, but just sort of running right over it, covering it with a bunch of other material, you're essentially doing more of a disservice, even worse than hiding it. So there's that, but then there's also, not talking about something or doing one throwaway sentence and just moving on, presenting it as kind of normal. And that comes into play with this book, The United States of Trump. Now, the individuals of events or examples of this aren't super important. Again, you can find them in the review, but the broad theme of seeing what people aren't focusing on that did happen, it's something that you need to be aware of when you're dealing with people. It doesn't mean they're bad, but we all have past experiences that shape who we are, and that's going to color what we choose to share or not, whether or not he's being partisan or just trying to placate Trump, anything like that. Now, regarding the president, O'Reilly covers a lot of interesting stuff that I think the people who don't get any information that is, from a right slant, could probably benefit from, because we get into these shouting matches. And one of the reasons I started doing what I do is because Dan Carlin mentioned this on Common Sense podcast years ago, that we don't read the same books anymore. It used to be, we had the 3 TV channels plus PBS, and people used to have, the sort of base literature and the base papers. You would read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and maybe a paper from somewhere else closer to where you lived. But everyone was basing their arguments on similar material. Whereas now it's more of, you got these people over to one side, and they get all their information from certain sources. And then you've got these people on another side, and they get all their information from entirely different sources. And I mean, this is something interesting that happened in the sort of internet revolution, and the fact that people like me are just able to share stuff. from our houses. And all of a sudden there was this like erosion of credible sources. And this is not to say that I'm credible or not, or other people are credible or not, but there used to be that very high barrier for entry. And by doing that, only certain information would be shared. And you would think that there's kind of, there's a little bit more checking that goes on. And for a while there, we got away from this. Any sort of information source was considered equivalent. And you guys remember this on your various social media. You'd see something shared, it would seem to relate to your prior belief, or it'd be amazing or whatever, and you'd share it, and then it'd be completely false. And we did that a lot for a few years. Now, maybe the 2016 election was, one reason why we're starting to get away from that. But I'm sure we all just got burned enough times. We had enough times of our buddy or a family member Googling something that we just shared and saying, "Hey, you idiot, why did you share this thing that is blatantly false?" And so we all get kind of tired of looking dumb to our family and friends, and we started double checking stuff, and then we all it circles back, and we go back to these more reliable sources. Now, it's interesting, and O'Reilly gets into this quite a bit because obviously media is rather important in the whole Trump narrative. And as far as what media can be quote unquote trusted, or what bias exists within media, if you read enough history books or biographies or anything dealing with the past that is going to quote or cite or anything regarding papers or other news sources from decades or centuries in the past, I think the bias becomes a little bit more obvious, because we get people today and you're sort of married to whatever your news sources are, and you don't want to admit that bias of your favorite news sources goes along with your own personal bias. But it probably does, and this makes sense. Obviously, we want to hear more about things that we agree with than things that we disagree with. But if you go back and you read some stuff about what the New York Times was saying in the 1930s, or what the Washington Post was saying, or what the Wall Street Journal was saying, and I use those three because those are the three sources that I cover every day. But of course you can go into different magazines as well, different newspapers, and it becomes a little bit more obvious that they can be wrong. These are not perfect sources, but they're probably a little bit closer to truth, and we can get into truth another day, or a little bit more fact-based than sources that don't have the same accountability. And this is something I get into with friends and family members as far as big companies and accountability. And so a lot of people are anti-corporation right now, but there are certain protections when you choose to go with a brand name or a larger company, because they have more to lose. And so when you get into these very small either news sources or random blogs and whatnot, they can just yes, there's an advantage to being able to say whatever without corporate overlords dictating what you're going to be writing down. but you're also able to say things that either A, aren't necessarily backed up by evidence, or B, are just off the rails, harmful. And according to O'Reilly, there's a very left-leaning bias in the media. Now, this is a common view. It seems to be on the right. And O'Reilly's explanation for this, which I thought was interesting, this is something that you've probably been exposed to before, is that the relatively few corporations who own the majority of the media are influenced by sources who are predominantly liberal. So if you're a big corporation and you have an entertainment wing, you're dealing with Hollywood. Hollywood is on the left-leaning side, and that sort of ends up shaping. Now, I don't know how much you want to take this into play as far as if it's 100% factual. Obviously, Fox News has had plenty of success, and they have an entertainment division. Now, they might be more centrist than certain extremist versions on the right as far as media sources. So that could have something to do with being a big corporate entity instead of the Breitbarts or the the Storm website, the Daily Stormer, that sort of stuff. But still, I will play this world's smallest violin for Fox News whining that there is a left-leaning bias in the media. But when we're trying to take a sort of broad perspective, how do we bring people together? We have a lot more in common than we have differences, and the whole media, this and that, bad. It probably balances out. I would imagine that there's enough going on that if one side has a certain advantage in certain areas, maybe print media, another side has a certain advantage in other ways. So I feel like that's a lot of yelling at each other over something that probably is less consequential than it might be. Now, Trump's personality. So how do we work this into sort of a broad thematic concept? You have someone who is very motivated to succeed, but to be recognized for succeeding. And O'Reilly says that his sort of fatal flaw is, his insecurity. So Trump being insecure, and then anyone who is against him is immediately an enemy and has to be destroyed, attacked. And we've seen that plenty of times. And that's his way of sort of posturing, maintaining his quote-unquote strength, to be in sync with the persona that he's created. Now, you can take this insecurity, and it doesn't have to be something that you attack. Oh, this person's insecure. That's his weakness. Let's attack that. It's something that you can use to sort of approach somebody and work together in conjunction with that person. Now, if O'Reilly is correct in the four pillars of Trump's presidency are destroying radical Islam or Islamic terrorism. So ISIS is now essentially out of the way. I'm sure there's other problems, and of course right now we've gone with the Iran thing, but I don't want this to be too much of a current events stuff. But if we take that aspect, he's worried about immigration, so stopping the illegal immigration. he's worried about the economy, and so getting the economy up and running, and then not wanting other countries, to exploit America economically. So if you take all that stuff, I think there's a lot that you could find common ground on in there. So Trump's strategy was to find something that 50% of the people who are going to vote or were going to vote would latch onto, and then just pound media-wise, and we'll get into that in just a moment. So he found that those four aspects, under the broad umbrella of security and we're losing our country, resonated with about 50% of the voters. Now, I'll factor the Electoral College into that. Certain people will yell that he lost the popular vote. O'Reilly would respond that if you take the huge difference in California voting out of the mix, then Trump wins by a lot, and that California is basically a whole other country. But, it's one big, very diverse, different in different area country, and we can't just lop one state off and say that, hey, this doesn't count. As much as the Texan secession movement might want to. I think that ship has sailed, at least for now. But sorry, I just lost my place there for a moment. I'm sure it'll happen many more times over the following episodes. But as far as his finding the 50% or enough, just enough voters, he latched on to something that so many people would support. And I have these conversations with family members and friends of, not all his supporters are as terrible as my family and certain family and friends make them out to be. So it's tough when you have a large number of people willing to entirely toss another section of the same country and say that they are, well, we could get into the deplorables thing. Quick side note on the deplorables thing. So that would be what, if you take half, I think she said, this is Hillary, half of Trump supporters and label them deplorables. So that would be, about 30 million Americans plus Trump supporters who couldn't vote at the time. Obviously, she would take it back. We'll cover her book, What Happened, on another day. But that's not helping. Now you can counter with Trump is alienating huge groups as well, but two wrongs don't make him a right, obviously. So finding that big group, and O'Reilly gets into how Hillary played identity politics. Now, this is a typical thing that conservatives will say about liberals, that liberals are really more divisive and breaking people up into different groups and then picking out, I want this group and I want that group and I want that group, and if I get these groups to vote for me, then I win the election. So yes, in a sense, it is about forming a coalition. But Trump had a very simple, easy to sell proposition for a coalition that he could focus on and win the presidency. Now, obviously, it's not easy, and he was and is mastermind, brilliant as far as media and manipulation and staying in the limelight, which I say yet again we will cover in just a couple minutes. But it'll be important for anyone. This is not a demagogue or populist type thing. And this is covered in Bruce Bueno de Mesquite, and I believe it's Alistair Smith is his co-author. Their book, The Dictator's Handbook, talking about forming coalitions. And we'll get into that one another day as well. But you form that coalition that is going to get you to win the election. And he had that very simple one. We're losing the country. There's always a they. Even with liberals, there's a they. And even with libertarians, there's a they. This is not a left-right thing. This is a center thing as well, because they are easy to rail against. It's always easier to get people to say that they don't like something than it is to get them to say that they do like something, or agree on a solution to it. So you can get people to say that they hate traffic, but getting a whole bunch of people to agree on the solution to traffic is a lot harder, like exponentially harder. So just as a little example. So I think we've covered that enough for now. Regarding the media thing, Trump is, and a lot of people don't want to admit this, but it's just brilliant what he's able to do. And O'Reilly covers this a lot. It's a great aspect of the book that he knows what he's doing. This is he being Trump, not O'Reilly. And this is, again, big thematic stuff. You don't have to get into a birther issue with Obama. You don't have to talk about building walls or other divisive stuff. But it's got to be attention grabbing. It's got to get your base fired up. And that's what Trump was doing. So I was watching Trevor Noah earlier tonight. And, it's easy to say Trump hates Mexicans. But it's not like, and this is one more line from the book, I'm paraphrasing that O'Reilly says, Trump doesn't hate groups. Now, possible exception for saying something negative about groups being that he's not a big fan of Muslims. That's more because, again, according to O'Reilly, Muslims as a whole in like many nations or Muslim nations have not risen up and decrying or declaring that jihad against the West is horrible. Now, you could get into the facts behind that, but as far as general perception, that's what's bothering Trump about. That's kind of a whole group thing, but I'm sure it's not to the level of hate, or at least I'd like to think so. And O'Reilly certainly thinks that way. So if he doesn't hate groups, he'll say the rapists and the murderers and that sort of stuff. And I'm sure there are some nice people. And, the same thing with, we get into Charlottesville, and O'Reilly mentions that as well. But without the hatred of groups, it's more he's going for media stuff. You can say that the birther thing against Obama was racist, and it can come across that way, and a lot of his other statements can come across that way, and in a 2019 racism way, I'm sure you have a point. But it's what he's doing is getting his base fired up. Now, what does that say about his base? In certain cases, that's a debate that might be worth having. But, and this is one of the omissions that I think, one can fault O'Reilly for, that he doesn't dive into. If this sort of stuff is firing up his base, are there problems that could arise from that? And he doesn't cover at all certain hate crimes that have cited language that is very similar to what Trump uses, or have cited Trump as an inspiration anyway. And that can be problematic, because even if Trump himself is innocent of doing certain things that are, hate crimes, or, very negative towards certain minority groups or disadvantaged groups, if somebody is sort of inciting his followers to do that, this can be a problem, which probably needs to be addressed. But that's an interesting concept. I mean, you, as a leader in your community or your city or state, or, your household, will have to decide, the certain responsibility that you take. But it behooves you to learn from the attention grabbing that Trump is able to do. I mean, have you gone one day in nearly 3 years now without thinking about who the president of the United States is? And as popular as Obama was and still is, there's something to be said for Trump's ability to stay in the headlines. Now, you can say it's for negative reasons, but to the people who support him, they want to see him, and I'm sure a lot of people want to see their leader out, visible, working for what he has promised them that he's going to do. And so I think that's an important concept to take with you. All right, so that's what we're going to cover for this episode. I do want to thank the patrons. I have a few of them so far, family and friends, and I want to thank them. If you're interested in supporting this project, thank you for your interest. You can go to www.patreon, that's patreon.com/Fountain of Chris. No dashes, no spaces, no underscores, just Fountain of Chris. Also all over social media. And yeah, I think that'll do it for the inaugural episode. Now I just have to determine if we're going to be calling this United Individuals or Unified Individuals or Individuals United. But these are all details we can work out in future days. Next one of these is going to be about the Book of Gutsy Women by Hillary Rodham Clinton and her daughter, Chelsea Clinton. And that should be out relatively soon, another day or two.